Bugünün 4. oturumda 3 tane konuşmacımız var. Bunlardan bir tanesi Paul Hawk, Edinburgh Üniversitesi'nden bize yeni nesil kurumsal arşivler konusunda bilgi verecek. Paul Hawk. İkinci konuşmacımız Pedro Príncipe, Minho Üniversitesi. Bize açık bilim için Open Air hizmet ve servisleri konusunda bilgi verecek. Ve üçüncü konuşmacımız da açık inovasyon konusunda Murat Girgin, Açık İnovasyon Derneği'nden.
Hello, well, thank you for inviting me to speak and inviting me to come to Izmir. I'm really delighted to be here. I should tell you that I don't actually work for the University of Edinburgh anymore. I resigned last week. So I now actually have my own company, which is an exciting new venture for me. But I will be continuing to work in open access and research data management. Today I'm representing the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, CORE, to talk about a working group. So I'd like to start by just saying a few things about our current repository systems, the actually surprisingly successful distribution of institutional repositories around the world. And I think it's worth just celebrating that for a moment before we talk about the next generation. And in fact, there are some properties of the current repository infrastructure which are really important and which allow us to think about the next generation. So the first here is just the fact that the technology is now mature. It's proven technology, it's well established, it's well supported. We have some really amazing open source communities around a lot of the tools that we use. They're very, very well established, well governed. These are actually quite rare things in software development. We should remember that we have these things and we should exploit them. And the second is the fact that we have this strong community around our repository systems, not just the software developers, but the people who are involved in actually using them to manage institutional repository records and so on, the people that are here, these kinds of groups. Sorry. Okay, I don't know what happened there, but I think it was all right. And thirdly, and I think the most important aspect, is that we have distributed control of those resources. The fact that the repositories are distributed across our institutions and across domains and disciplines, those people control what's in those repositories. And this is a really important property of the current infrastructure and something we should be careful to preserve and to build on. So I'm going to say a quick word about the actual group that I'm going to be talking about, the work of. So this is a group of the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, CORE. CORE is a really impressive organization in terms of its global reach. I mean, it has members from all of the continents, from Europe, North America, but also from Asia, Africa. It's well represented. Apparently, we have 35 countries represented in CORE, which is pretty good, I think. And that's the obligatory slide that just lists the members of the Next Generation Repositories group. I'm sure these slides will be available, so you can see this later. So this is the goal of the group. This is the simple mission statement, if you like, of this particular group. And implicit in this goal is the idea that this is really introducing competition to the current global scholarly infrastructure. This is about trying to find an alternative, one where the control is distributed and open access becomes a lot easier. So the objectives that we've set ourselves to meet this goal, the first thing we've really looked at is interoperability between repositories. And I'll come on to talk about some technologies and some aspects of that in a moment. To really encourage the development of services elsewhere that can use repositories as the resource base for new services. This is probably the most crucial part of this. If people aren't interested in developing services on top of our repositories, then our repositories are doomed to be silos of content. And then we have this very grand ambition, because you have to set yourself a big ambition to motivate people sometimes, which is to transform the entire system. We have some principles which we've set ourselves and which we're trying to adhere to. I've talked about the distribution of control. Inclusiveness is really important. I've been working in this sort of general area for many years now, actually. And what I really like about the efforts that CORE make is the focus on including people from countries outside of the usual countries which I've worked with, which is essentially Northern Europe and North America. And CORE has really, I think, been quite successful at engaging people from other places. And we think this is important because different regions of the world actually have very different policy agendas and different requirements. So we're trying to make sure that those are included in the discussions and those are addressed. This idea of developing for the public good. You know, this is what open access is about. This is what open science is about, I think, in the end. I mean, the direct beneficiaries of open science are scientists, but the real beneficiaries in the end is society at large, and it's the public that should benefit. And lastly, what I call intelligent openness. So it's accepted that what we are interested in is openness, open data, open resources, but it's actually it requires more than simply making something openly licensed. You actually have to put a lot of work into helping people to get to those resources and to use them. So we need to apply a degree more intelligence to this. And I'll talk a little about some of that in a second. So there are a number of outputs which we expect to provide. There are some direct outputs, which are the reports which we're working on, and some architectures and descriptions. And we're also recommending particular technologies in some cases. We're trying to be careful not to prejudice too much which technologies people use, but there are some technologies which are so important in this area that it is correct for us to recommend them. And then there are the indirect outputs, which it's interesting to me that these are already starting to appear. And an example of this is where people who are working in the group, but who also have an involvement in developing repository platforms, people in, for example, the DSpace community or the Fedora community, they are actually beginning to implement some of the things which we haven't even officially recommended yet, but which they know we're going to. So there is already a head start with some of the technical development, which is really very reassuring, because that effort and initiative is coming from those people, not from us. And then we have some design assumptions, focus on resources. A lot of our repository systems in the past have had a particular focus on metadata and have not really had much to say about the actual resources within the repositories, and this is something we do need to address. We're all about pragmatism. We favour simple approaches. As I say, I have worked in this area for many years, and I could tell you over a beer stories of some of the really long-running projects to develop metadata schemes that are incredibly complex and which never got adopted. So what we're trying to do is to keep things very simple. We're trying to create recommendations for really simple changes which can make a big difference. This includes the idea of convention over configuration. So this is a phrase from software engineering which suggests that if people are already starting to converge on a particular way of doing things by convention, then recognize that and adopt that. Don't try to force people into some other direction with a heavy standardization process. And lastly, this idea of engaging with users. And one of the really important things which we recognize in this work is that users of repositories are not necessarily people. They can actually be other systems, software, machines. And as we know, with open science, this becomes increasingly important. So everything that we're doing and recommending, we're trying to always assess whether it is something which is going to not be an obstacle to the adoption of those different types of users. So the approach that we've taken to thinking through this work and producing some outputs and documentation is to consider what we call repository behaviors. This is a word which we've deliberately, an idea which we've deliberately made up because we found ourselves in arguments about whether we were creating use cases or whatever. And by behaviors, we just mean a very general sense of the sorts of functions which repositories provide. And then we've tied those to user stories, which are a bit more precise. They're about actual requirements that people have. And then finally, we will map these to technological recommendations and particular technologies. So far, and this is not a complete thing, not a complete list, but this is the list we have so far of behaviors. And I've just today tried to group them into four categories. So there's a category which is all about discovery of content. And as we know, our repositories, one of the most important things that they're there to do is to allow people to discover the resources that are contained within. But there are different types of discovery. There's the very passive discovery, which is very common in repositories already, where other systems harvest metadata about resources and discover them this way. Something which is really poorly implemented in repositories currently is the ability to navigate between resources within the repositories, so even to get from a metadata record to the resource which is being described by that metadata record is actually quite problematic in a lot of repository systems. And often it's impossible to do this in an automated way. But also a kind of discovery which is about the repositories actively notifying other systems of the existence of resources or changes to those resources. And we're looking at an entire kind of second system underpinning all of this, which would provide notifications and hubs where other systems can register an interest in events going on in repositories. There's a whole aspect of the social network. Users now are so thoroughly engaged with different systems that the users themselves have a presence in the network, and we need to recognize that, and our repositories need to treat those nodes in the network as entities in their own right. And that allows the creation of really exciting new services. An example of one which has got a lot of people working on it now is open peer review. So imagine the consequences of being able to provide a proper peer review system on our open access repositories. That would be some kind of challenge to our commercial publishers right now. Preservation is a natural function of repositories, I think. Some of our repository systems engage in preservation in a sophisticated way, some less so, but it's a part of most repositories. And then finally, this ability to support unknown other services. So clearly in open science, there's a great deal of interest in being able to do text mining, data mining of our resources. So our repositories should really be developed to support that much better than they do at the moment. So those are some of the behaviors. What I'll talk about next are user stories. So this is a formulation from software development, from agile practices in software development. It's called a user story. And the idea is to capture a requirement in a very simple sentence which always has this form. So somebody wants to do something in order to achieve some benefit. And it's a nice way to really try to pin down the essence of a user requirement. And so we have started to catalogue these against our repositories within those behaviours, and I'll give you some examples. So these are example user stories which we have already written, which relate to discovery through navigation. So I won't read through all of these now because we're running behind time, but you get the idea, I hope. So the first one, as a human or machine user, I want to easily and uniformly identify metadata in a repository record so that I can ascertain the relevance of the resource. So imagine a researcher, I want to look at a metadata record and very quickly be able to decide if that is describing something of relevance to me. If I'm a machine, if I'm a software process, I want to be able to do that, except I want to do 1 million in an hour, very, very fast. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of the next generation repository which we think are starting to emerge. I mean, this may be obvious, but it's certainly not the case at the moment. But we think the repositories need to be very much more connected to each other and to other systems. And that is at the level of the resources. It's not about connecting one system to another system. It's about connecting the resources in one system to the resources in another system. It's essentially the way the web is supposed to work. It's a network. And that can be individual metadata records, individual resources, individual users of these systems, of the repositories. And then as part of this, there are some aspects which are self-evidently important. So I'm sure we've all heard about the importance of persistent identifiers, global persistent identifiers. Well, the reason we keep hearing this is because they really are important. And the situation is improving at the moment. We have a greater adoption of global identifiers such as ORCID and ISNI and DOI clearly. But we still need, there's a long way to go. We still need to be really embedding these identifiers into our systems. As soon as we do that, then a repository that uses those kinds of identifiers is able to participate much more fully in the global web of systems. And another characteristic which is emerging, which I mentioned a little earlier, is this idea that repositories need to be active. So our repository systems have tended to be quite passive systems. Content is added to them, not much else happens. Hopefully people find it there and maybe they use those resources. But our repositories could be, with a fairly modest change to the technology, they could be advertising themselves, marketing very precisely to researchers who need to know that this resource has changed, this file has been updated, this new content has been added. And they need to be able to listen for requests for that kind of change as well. Not just the blanket batch process that we have at the moment, but more finely tuned, so that we can start to quite easily conceive of services for researchers which are tailored to those particular researchers' needs. This is what allows us to then think about things like peer review systems and so on. I think an important part of all of this is it's about recognizing understanding the workflow of the researcher and being able to add value into that workflow at different points. So that's a blog post that I read about this 2 years ago, which was the reason I got involved in this project. So I recommend if you're interested in that idea, you have a look at that. The URL is there. You'll be able to read that later. Another particular thing, and this is a particular technology which has emerged in our discussions and which we will definitely be recommending, is this idea of signposting. So this is a little technical, but essentially this is about using what are called HTTP link headers. So in the web, hidden from human users. There's a lot of metadata that's exchanged every time you click on a link and go to a web page. And there is a facility in there to put links to other resources, which would not be used by the human user, but would be understood by a software process. And the reason this is important in the repositories context is because of the problem that we have with our repositories currently, which is this notion of what we call the splash page. So when you go to a resource in a repository, typically you get a web page with some description of the resource and maybe some links to click on to go to that resource. But it is useless for a software process, for another system to use. There's nothing standard in there. It needs a human person to read and understand what to click on. But with this signposting approach, again, this is an example of convention over configuration. It's about adopting what is already there and just adding a little bit of value and saying, well, we'll just have a standard way of describing those links so that if somebody has adopted signposting for their repository pages, then a software process which arrives at that URL, because that's the authoritative URL for that resource, will be able to find the metadata, will be able to find the resource itself. Maybe it can find information about how many times people have used it, all of those kinds of things which people want to find. But it can be done in an automated way. So signposting is one of the technologies we actually plan to recommend. And I said earlier that some of the repository platforms were already developing some of these technologies, and this is an example. This has already been built into the latest version of DSpace, and I believe into one of the flavors of Fedora. So I like this picture. This picture was drawn by a man called Herbert van der Sompel, who some of you will know of from the digital library world. But I think this is a good picture, and it really sums up what we have discovered, which is that we are really dealing with 5 types of entity in all of the discussions which we have. So we have content, which is of 2 varieties, really. There's the content which is actually in the repository, the kind of the content which the repository is designed to collect and hold. And then there's the content which is potentially overlaid on top of that, the content which is provided by other people. So this might be the annotations or the peer reviews, comments, supplementary data, whatever it is. And then similarly with metadata, we have metadata which is that we're probably all familiar with, the descriptive metadata which describes the resource. And then we have the activity metadata, which is all of that stuff about how people are using the resources, which is really interesting and valuable information. Earlier we saw a slide about Sci-Hub and the usage of Sci-Hub, and that tells us quite a lot, actually. And then the 5th entity is the person, the user, who is an entity in this system and should be treated as such. So that's my final slide. So that you'll remember that was our goal, to position repositories as the foundation for a distributed, globally networked infrastructure for scholarly communication, no less. The good news is we already have quite a lot of what we need. I think there is also a desire to challenge and change the status quo. I really enjoyed the speech this morning. I've forgotten the professor's name, but he was talking about the square and the tower. And I'm reliably informed those are the correct Turkish words for this. And finally, I'd just like to say, together we can establish a scholarly communication infrastructure that we can be proud of, and that, really importantly, that our children will thank us for. Thank you.